District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. How is it already mid-October this month, and the year is flying by so fast? Can you believe the election, American listeners, is less than 3 weeks away from today? I just came back from Europe, and while my media trip was not really wildlife focused, there were a lot of interesting wildlife themes and some wildlife that I did see in both Poland and Denmark. I was primarily in Poland to attend the Auschwitz journalism seminar in wake of current events and rising anti-Semitism. And one of the eeriest things I saw, this was a weird juxtaposition. I have video of this. I'm not going to share this because I think it'd be disrespectful to do so. But I think interestingly enough, I saw deer at the former death camp, and that was really eerie. I mean, the experience for me was extremely emotional, but I saw roe deer and fallow deer galloping and running all across Auschwitz-Birkenau too. So it was kind of eerie, chilling, creepy, where so much mass carnage was, and you see wildlife, an odd juxtaposition, interesting juxtaposition, you could say. But when I went to Denmark, more interestingly enough, I saw a lot more of the wildlife motifs that are kind of interesting to you listeners. And Poland does have wild game opportunities too. I didn't get to eat any wild game in Poland, sadly. But in Denmark, I had an opportunity to see a little bit more of fishing and wildlife and hunting in the flesh, to kind of cheer myself up after spending a couple days at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And in the Newport Center in Copenhagen, they have lots of fishing charters. So I felt right at home seeing that. I don't know if you guys know this if you've ever been to Denmark, but there's like 33 species you can catch in the Copenhagen Bay. So I felt right at home. It's close to the Baltic Sea, very different from where my family is from in Lithuania, but I loved seeing that. There was also a lot of different taxidermy. I was in the Danish foreign minister's office during culture night on Friday of last week. So it was really cool to see a muskox. I presume he harvested or someone in that country harvested for display. So that was really cool to see that, kind of learn more about the wildlife there in Denmark because they own Greenland, and Greenland is home to a lot of muskox, if you didn't know that. So Europe likes hunting like us. I think they use guns more for hunting than we do in the United States. Of course, we hunt and use guns here for self-defense purposes, but in Europe, hunting is actually pretty popular. So if you have some reservations about Europe, don't feel like everyone is hostile to our way of life. You'll be surprised to learn that a lot of people actually do like our hunting and fishing lifestyle. They wish they had a Second Amendment. So Europe, don't write it off entirely. You'd be surprised to find a lot of anglers and hunters there too. Before I talk about the presidential campaign and some of my thoughts with that, and also Bears Ears, I have to talk about that briefly, and how 1.3 million acres of the enlarged national monument is now totally off limits to recreational shooting unless you go hunting, which is stupid because what is to say they won't forbid hunting on this premise that they've done, the BLM. A quick update to the story I brought you with the Appalachian homestead, Shallon and her husband. Due to the pressure we applied through our interview, some other social media gestures and posts, and I think 81,000 comments, I'm happy to report that our little podcast played a role alongside Virginia Delegate Nick Freitas and a couple of others in helping to reopen portions of the George Washington and Jefferson National Forest here in Virginia, the two districts, Mount Rogers WMA and Clinch Ranger District, totaling about 300,000 acres, are now reopened to hunting, fishing, foraging opportunities. So we were happy to apply pressure. This is what we live for. This is what I hope the podcast can do, to apply maximum pressure when government agencies are not keeping in line with their mission statement for multiple use, for allowing recreational opportunities. So we were happy to play a small but very important role in this reopening decision. We don't know if this will be revoked or changed in the future. Hopefully not, but this is what happens. You can make a difference with doing a gesture like this. We were happy to record that. I was really happy to record that right before I went to Europe. So it kind of reemphasizes that people can be change makers and use social media for good to apply maximum pressure to make sure public lands remain open to the public. If we have any more updates on this story, I will bring back our previous guests and others who were involved in the story. But for now, that is some good news to report. Let's talk briefly about the Walz debacle while he was at the Minnesota Pheasant opener. I've dedicated a lot of the podcast to Tim Walz and his record. I've written about it, so I'm not really going to go run on about his record, where he stands. I think it can be surmised and assumed, given what he's done as governor, some of his actions, and this recent embarrassing episode for a guy who claims to be an experienced hunter and shooter. To see him go to the field in the Minnesota opener and improperly handle a shotgun, struggle to properly load a shotgun. He doesn't like semi-automatic firearms. If you pay attention closely to his rhetoric, he thinks they're assault weapons. And it's funny and ironic, he was using a semi-automatic pump-action shotgun. If I'm not mistaken, the Beretta, I believe that he was using the A400 is a pump-action shotgun, to my knowledge. I could double-check and cross-reference. But he did not know how to load the thing, and it was such a disservice to that beautiful gun. Beretta makes wonderful guns. Not only was he improperly handling it and could have caused like a Dick Cheney-like incident. I don't begrudge anyone using Beretta. If I could buy one and use one, I will. But if you're trying to be the regular man, the folksy Midwestern dad that Tim Walz claims to be, you're not going to be using a Beretta shotgun. That's worth thousands of dollars. You're going to be using something that is more moderately priced to say that you're relatable. So the optics there looked really bad. I mean, the loading itself was embarrassing. I had secondhand embarrassment for the governor of Minnesota. And then the fact that optically it looks really bad when you're trying to relate to the person and you're using one of the more expensive shotguns in the market. Not to mention when the pheasant hunt opener was kind of first teased, there were no guns initially in the picture. It was just people in blaze orange talking and walking and gabbing and whatnot. So that kind of looked very strange optically too. And perhaps he had nerves, or maybe he's not as good of a hunter as he claims to be. Only one person in his party successfully got a pheasant, and they couldn't successfully retrieve the pheasant. Not the best optics to display to media members who really don't know much about Pittman Robertson hunting, conservation, or they only think the acceptable kind of hunting is upland bird hunting. Now, granted, I have been reassured by some friends of mine that Tim Walz does know how to pheasant hunt. He's done it before. That's to the extent of the only type of hunting he really does. He doesn't really do much of deer hunting. He doesn't do big game hunting. He hasn't really celebrated National Shooting Sports Month up until this year, allegedly, I was told by some folks at the National Shooting Sports Foundation. He's not putting out anything reassuring to hunters. Where's his statement on Colorado Prop 127? About the prohibition on mountain lion hunting, which will have wide sweeping effects on all forms of hunting. He has not said anything about the hijacking and takeover of wildlife agencies by anti-hunting, anti-angling groups. He will likely, if he and Harris were to advance in the election, double down on what the Biden-Harris administration is doing. I can't even tell you, and we've talked about this on the podcast. Again, this is just me summarizing why I think their outreach to hunters and anglers this late in the game. Why are you doing it 3 weeks before the election? Shouldn't you have had a game plan beforehand? Why I think this outreach is going to fall on deaf ears. Why I think most sportsmen and women, if they follow politics, if they're attuned to this election, are not going to warm up to Harris and Walz, especially to Harris. She thought that by deputizing Walz as her running mate, she will appeal to rural people. She is the most unrelatable person. And then she talked, of course, about having firearms, even though she has promised confiscation of lawfully owned firearms. She's made firearms ownership extremely difficult for Californians. She has supported universal background checks, which will do nothing to stop one crime. We already have background checks. They just need to be enforced. We don't need to add any more burdens to the process of background checks, because multi-day waits for a background check could be a matter of life and death for people wanting to either purchase a firearm or get their concealed handgun permit. Let's say if it's a domestic abuse survivor or someone of that nature. And also, you shouldn't have to wait more than a couple hours to have your background check go through. It's ludicrous that you would even say several days will stop a would-be perpetrator from committing heinous acts. If someone is gung-ho about committing a crime, no background check wait, additional background wait is going to deter them from committing the crime. There's no evidence supporting that. Even some outlets that I have cited before, Rand Corporation. Rand does a lot of these studies that are not really right of center. They are pretty kind of middle of the road, center left, and even the Rand Corporation has said that universal background checks and universal red flag laws really don't do anything to deter crimes. They create actually more problems, infringe on rights. And Vice President Harris has also said that she supports revoking PLACA, which is the law that supposedly insulates gun companies from liability, but there's actually 5 or 6 exceptions, meaning they can be held liable for some mishandling of guns. So there's not total immunity for the firearms industry. And that law is very essential to prevent frivolous lawsuits from being filed against companies for people misusing, or criminals rather, misusing their products. Throughout Vice President Harris's political career, and I remember when she first became my attorney general, I did not vote for her. I didn't trust her at the time, and I don't trust her now. She has been virulently anti-gun. And her admission to Oprah, I believe it was, saying that she owns a Glock and that if someone were to break into her house, she would shoot them or pop them, or whatever phrasing she alluded to in that interview. A gun owner would not joke about wanting to take someone's life. We treat firearms ownership really seriously. You don't want to have to use your firearm. And the way that she casually dismissed it to be like, well, I'm just going to shoot someone who comes through the door. Remember, President Biden said, shoot a shotgun through the door. I'm paraphrasing what he says, but shoot a shotgun, if an intruder comes to your house, just fire at the door. That could create so many untold problems. She had the same reckless rhetoric. So it leads me to believe that she's maybe not as sincerely of a gun owner. I'd like to see proof of her actually having it. Of course, I don't think we should be demanding, show proof that you have it, but I doubt she has one. Even if she claims she has a Glock, her rhetoric just doesn't sound like she's a gun owner whatsoever, just how she casually dismissed, oh, we're just going to, shoot someone through the door if someone tries to break in. You don't take joy in that. You don't take glee in that. You don't want to have to do that, except if someone is taking or wanting to take your life or infringe on your safety and well-being, intruding in your home or on the street. So the hunter-angler outreach, they have 3 points about how they support conservation. We're going to protect the Second Amendment, and we're going to conserve wild spaces. I debunked a lot of that in my town hall column, why I think it's so disingenuous that they're claiming to do this. But the Biden-Harris administration has done the exact opposite. Regarding conserving lands, you all have heard me talk about 30 by 30. They claim that is to protect lands permanently and to preserve wild spaces. So 41 million acres have been closed off or protected or preserved in their mind, but essentially closed off to multiple uses. And we're going to talk about one instance of that that's going to probably be added to that 41 million mix. The Bears Ears now becoming off limits to recreational shooting, except if you go hunting. But what is to say hunting wouldn't be prohibited on that too? They could always change the plan. They could always add more restrictions if they were to. If this administration or a Harris-Walz administration were to take office in January. And so 30 by 30 is not a conservation plan. It's a rewilding plan. And when you lock these lands and take them off limits, you can invite a lot of problems. Not only the diminishment of access, you can also create untold biological problems, ecological problems, no forest management, no wildlife management, and in national monuments that they have created to tee up to basically make into national parks. And I think that's a total bastardization of the national park system. Not everything deserves to be a national park. They're sacred crown jewels. They are really extraordinary. And if you're doing that to say no hunting, no fishing, no grazing, no farming, no ranching, no outfitting, that's a total disservice to the National Park Service, to public lands, and you don't want everything to become a national park. There's a lot of problems that we need. Of the available public land, I think most of it should still largely remain in the hands of BLM, Forest Service, and you should allow for multiple uses. And so this conserving wildlife spaces in their platform, again, it's not conservation, it's preservation. They're setting aside a lot of land to restrict your ability to recreate and even make a livelihood off of public lands. That's what I find problematic about that point. About expanding outdoor opportunities. We have talked at length about the numerous different closures, the numerous different prohibitions to how you can hunt and fish on wildlife refuges. There's now 8 and soon to be maybe 14 or double that amount of refuges where you cannot use lead tackle and bullets. They claim that we have a voluntary plan, kind of saying you can voluntarily choose to not use it, but there are prohibitions on lead tackle and bullets. That might sound minor to a lot of you there. Oh, well, we can always do an alternative. We could use bismuth, we could use copper, we could use this. These alternatives, while they sound very nice sounding, a lot of people cannot afford them. They are manifold times more expensive in the grand scheme of things than lead tackle and bullets. So someone starting out hunting and fishing on public lands is not going to be actively seeking out bismuth or copper alternatives to lead, tackle, and bullets. It's a lot more expensive, far more cost prohibitive. And when we look to see where these prohibitions go into effect in California, they were forecasting that lead prohibitions on public waters and public lands would lead to fewer people fishing and hunting, and they have seen that. It's led to a decimation of the industry, fewer dollars being pumped back to conservation when you put these prohibitions in effect. Similarly, in Europe, of all places, they did a similar study to this. They asked people in the EU if lead, tackle, and ammo prohibitions were put into effect, how many of you would forgo hunting and fishing altogether? That study found that a quarter of hunters and anglers polled will forgo those activities altogether. Could you imagine 25% of anglers and hunters in this country forgoing activities because they have to retrofit their tackle boxes or their ammo supply to these more expensive and arguably maybe not as efficient bullets, if we're talking about copper, bismuth, or some of the alternatives that some people are proposing? And if you want to offer this in the free market, offer people choices, but to say that we're going to slowly shift away from this and limit the market, you're going to turn off people to these activities, then you're not going to have conservation funding. It's going to create a very downward cycle of epic proportions, and we don't need any more attacks. And the fact that some people who claim to be sportsmen and women are leading the charge here through mandates, not everyone, not the people who are leading our industry, so to speak, but there are some people who say we have to do this, we have to, get ahead of the regulators and do this. I don't agree with that premise whatsoever. I think that's foolhardy. We don't have people we can trust. They're heavily influenced by the radical environmentalist wing of environmental movements and preservationists. So we don't need people like that dictating, because once you chip away slowly at some semblance of hunting and fishing, this is a death by 1,000 cuts. I know it sounds very minor and minuscule and maybe not relevant to your interests, but these death by 1,000 cut measures have wide sweeping impacts. You do this, you're going to lose access elsewhere. You ban one form of hunting, you're going to see subsequent bans of other forms of hunting, which is why I've brought on various people from Colorado to warn about that ballot initiative. We've talked to people in Washington State, California, all over the country, because they are like the canary in the coal mine. When their types of hunting, whether it was black bear hunting in California or Washington State, and even in Florida, people are dismissing the importance of the Sunshine State adopting an amendment to protect the right to hunt and fish. I have never seen so much blowback to a right and hunt and fish amendment and so much misinformation lobbied at the Yes on 2 folks. A lot of them are my friends who are behind this. Full disclosure, I don't monetarily benefit from it, but I have to disclose, of course. I think it's important to disclose that several of my friends are behind the efforts, so I would like to see them succeed. And we have, generally speaking, supported right to hunt and fish amendments. But to see a lot of people put out misinformation that you're going to lose property rights, you're going to see a decimation of wildlife under a right to hunt and fish amendment scheme, it's totally bunk. 23 states have this. This is not some fringe policy. So whether it's blue states trying to fight back gradual hunting and fishing prohibitions, or states like Florida that are trying to insulate themselves from future would-be prohibitions on hunting and fishing, this is extremely important. We will see the Harris-Walz administration, heaven forbid, if they advance into office, push some sort of agenda like this or double down on what the Biden-Harris administration has done. And obviously, I have made the case many times before. The third point about Second Amendment, Vice President Harris and Governor Walz are not friends of the Second Amendment. And when you attack the Second Amendment, prohibit lawful purchase of firearms and ammo, you also affect conservation funding. Hunting has nothing to do with the Second Amendment, but there is a connection through Pittman-Robertson, and that is the chief funding mechanism for habitat restoration, wildlife conservation, hunters education, and target shooting ranges on public lands. How much money will be lost if we were to see this perpetuation of Biden-Harris policies in a potential Harris-Walz administration? That makes me extremely nervous, which is why I'm sounding the alarm here. There are Democrats who go fishing and hunting. That needs to be communicated clearly. They're going to have some differences from me. I'm a full-fledged conservative Republican. I will work with, and I have found actually quite a bit of commonality with some center-left people in the outdoor industry for certain matters. We're not going to agree entirely. I think we may disagree 85, 90% of the time on different issues, electorally, politically. But believe it or not, you can find some sort of kinship and alignment with people. Hunting and fishing kind of brings people together. Like strange bedfellows, politically otherwise, we can actually agree on a lot of stuff for the outdoors. We may disagree on tactics, we may disagree on strategy, but I think we ultimately have the same goal of conserving, not preserving, wild spaces and bringing more people into the fold. There will be some people I know who are Democrats, who are sportsmen and women, who do support Harris-Walz, and they're within the right to do so, but you have to make no bones about it that you will lose a lot under a would-be Harris-Walz administration. Just look at the different attacks. And I've seen some of the more kind of center-left nonprofits who are claiming to be public lands champions. They're starting to criticize Democrats a bit more, but they are usually forced to do so when it's public pressure and social media pressure applied to them. So we have seen them be more critical of Republican administrations than they have Democrat administrations, especially with these land closures. Let's talk about Bears Ears now. So I'm skeptical that this hunters and anglers effort will do anything. And I think this recent decision to forbid public target shooting opportunities on Bears Ears is an example of that, very emblematic of that. And here's why. So I believe it's BLM and Forest Service. This is combined with both the BLM and Forest Service have finalized their plan for Bears Ears National Monument. We had friend of the show, Andrew Sandstrom, come talk about this a few months ago, that they were soon to be finalizing this. And this is a joint plan from both Bureau of Land Management, USDA. And they concluded that on the 1.36 million acres of public land in southeastern Utah, I've been to Bears Ears. I think it should be protected to some extent. I think the 300,000 acres that Trump brought it down to, the Trump administration brought it down to, was reasonable because you're not protecting everything entirely. Not everything on these 1.36 million acres of lands are antiquities. So there has to be a debate, like, what antiquities are you protecting? Mesquite cactus is not an antiquity. Indian artifacts are antiquities. So how many acres of land actually are home to antiquities? That's the debate, and that's something I explored in my reporting for Conservation Nation quite a few episodes ago. Is this enlargement, which I've been very critical of, actually emblematic of protecting antiquities, or is it a land grab? I'm tending, sadly, to lean towards the land grab, because when everything is antiquities, nothing is antiquity. So I think we have to have more nuance there. I've repeatedly called for and advocated for Antiquities Act reforms because presidents have wide sweeping power. It needs to be clarified what areas of antiquities, small compatible area, is actually an antiquity. How many acres? Are you actually protecting antiquities, or are you just creating a parcel of land, 1.36 million acres, just to make off limits? And this is what you see happen with these wide sweeping national monument designations. They have slowly but surely restricted recreational shooting. What is to say that this plan wouldn't encompass or be altered to include fishing, hunting opportunities, access as well? Because we have seen under Democratic administrations, they don't regard hunting and fishing as management tools, even though it's explicitly stated that they are. And national monuments under Bill Clinton, Obama did not respect this or not acknowledge that these activities were legitimate and within the confines of national monument designation. So we have seen repeatedly a loss of hunting and fishing, and obviously shooting sports access whenever these national monuments are so big and not really definitive of antiquities in its entirety. They are lumping in everything as antiquities instead of just the artifacts or certain objects of historical, scientific, or cultural significance. But you can't say everything at Bears Ears is antiquities. That's what is lost in the national monument debate, unfortunately. So from NSSF, let's read the statement about why they oppose this. Secretary Holland's proposed plan to close access to 1.3 million acres for recreational shooting is a violation of federal law, said Joe Bartozzi, NSSF president and CEO. Public lands must be made available for all the public to use. Federal law explicitly states that when closures of public lands are necessary, they may be limited in area and duration to achieve a specific stated objective. Secretary Holland has articulated none of the required criteria as required by law. The Secretary should rescind or drastically modify this misguided policy and apply the laws intended to the benefit of the public. And they explain the Dingell-Johnson Conservation Management Recreation Act, signed into law in 2019, sets the criteria upon the Secretary of the Department of Interior to only close public access to public lands, or that certain criteria may be used to justify the closure of public lands. The law limits the area and duration for which public access to federal lands may be closed. So I like that I forgot about that law. Only limitations, very few limitations. In fact, they have to be justified, but hopefully we never have to see limitations and closures of large-scale magnitudes like we are seeing here. Closures may only occur when a clear and quantifiable objective is identified. Holland's announcement to close 1.3 million acres to Bears Ears fails to meet these requirements. The Dingell Act states that federal lands will remain open to hunting, fishing, and recreational shooting in accordance with applicable law. That is, unless the Secretary establishes that a specific area may be closed for one or more reasons, including public safety, administration, or compliance with applicable laws. If that is to occur, the Secretary must limit the closure to the smallest area necessary and for the shortest time to achieve the stated purpose. NSSF continues regarding this Dingell Act of 2019. None of these criteria were met before Secretary Holland announced that public access will be denied to countless recreator shooters who, since the land is public, own these lands. The announcement will deny access in a manner detrimental to conservation funding. What is more appalling is that this punitive political action is occurring despite the absence of any indication that recreational shootings pose any viable threat to the monument's cultural, historic, or natural resources. This is why I have warned on this podcast that a continuation of Biden-Harris policies will invite more closures like this. Over 60 million acres in Alaska close to caribou hunting. Now this another million-acre closure, and then the 40-some-odd other million of acres closed. So how many total million acres are off limits now to certain recreational hunting, fishing, shooting sports opportunities? That's a lot of acres. We never saw this under the Trump-Pence administration. We wouldn't see this, I don't believe, under a would-be Trump-Vance administration. They would probably reopen a lot of these closures and not restrict the multiple use mandate or not restrict people from recreational shooting, going fishing, going hunting. We did see people. I've interviewed 2 former interior secretaries, both of Trump's interior secretaries. They were pretty pro-public lands. There was not one parcel of acres sold under the Trump administration last time. We have to make sure that they don't follow through with plans to put public housing on public lands. I think you're going to find even a lot of Republican resistance to that. That's not really a smart policy. You're not going to see a wholesale transfer of land to the states or even private interests. You'll find, again, a lot of conservative opposition to that. And if that were to transpire, I'll be critical, constructively, of course, and try to convince them otherwise from supporting that. Just promote multiple uses, allow the public to access. Don't do anything drastic like Biden-Harris is, but in the opposite direction. You don't want to tick off people. And we don't want to become like Europe and other countries where public waters, public lands are so scarce. This is what makes us so unique. Why our national park system, our public lands are the envy of the world. Canada wishes it could be like us. Europe wishes it could be like us, at least a lot of the hunters and anglers I speak to there. So we will see likely, I kind of foretold this earlier in the year, I would like to see, it's a wish of mine, to see some Antiquities Act reforms, going back to what a Biden-Harris, Harris-Walz policy looks like. They are supercharging with the Antiquities Act to close off public lands access. That is simply what you can take away from what they're doing. For permanent protection, which sounds nice, but it means you're going to lose access for recreational and commercial activities. And when you lose that access, unless you get some congressional act, you'll never get that access back. That is the problem here. So when you lose that access, especially by these democratic maneuvers, you will never get that access back, or it's going to take lawsuits or public pressure or some sort of undoing of a regulation to witness this restoration of public lands. I think if we get a Trump-Vance administration, you're going to see on day one a lot of executive orders undoing not only the energy stuff, energy prohibitions, but even these attacks on public lands with respect to restricting hunting, fishing, and shooting sports access. You're going to see a lot of that, I can tell you now. Not because I have some special insider information. This is just from what I've been able to collect and surmise from analyzing both administrations and just from speaking to, again, people who used to work in the past administration, knowing where they actually stand on public land. Let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.